David Meyer found the tape while clearing out his father's garage 9 days after the funeral, tucked behind a box of tax records, labeled in handwriting he recognized instantly. "Don't watch until I'm gone." The date scrawled beneath it read 22 years earlier, meaning his father, Walter, had recorded this message when David was still in college, and had lived, apparently unwilling to explain why, for more than 2 decades after making it. Walter Meyer worked 31 years as a production supervisor at Grantham Chemical Company, retiring at 68 with a modest pension and a reputation among neighbors and co-workers alike as dependable, quiet, and unfailingly cautious. Qualities his children, David and his sister Karen, had simply understood as personality rather than, as the tape would soon reveal, a coping mechanism. Walter's face appeared on the television, visibly younger, sitting stiffly in the same garage. David now stood in, beginning with a sentence that made both siblings go still. "If you're watching this, it means I never found the courage to say what I'm about to tell you while I was still alive, to face the consequences myself." Walter described discovering in 1988 evidence that Grantham Chemical had been illegally discharging untreated wastewater byproducts into a creek bordering the facility's property for at least 3 years, a violation he stumbled onto while reviewing routine maintenance logs that didn't match the facility's official environmental compliance reports. At 34, with his wife 6 months pregnant with Karen and a mortgage payment he couldn't have covered without his Grantham salary, Walter brought the discrepancy to his plant manager, who made the threat explicit rather than subtle. Report it, and Walter's position, along with any hope of the pension he'd already spent a decade building toward, would disappear within the month. Walter stayed silent, but he didn't destroy the evidence. He photocopied the maintenance logs, collected water samples in labeled jars, and preserved several years of internal correspondence documenting the cover-up, storing everything in a safety deposit box he never told his wife about, a private, unresolved reckoning he carried for the rest of his working life. Walter recorded the tape 22 years earlier, following a health scare, a suspicious mass later confirmed benign, that made him confront for the first time the real possibility of dying. With the documentation still locked away and unexplained, a fear that pushed him to record instructions in case the diagnosis had gone differently. Once cleared of the health scare, Walter told the camera, in a section recorded separately and dated 8 years later, that he'd simply never found a moment that felt right to reopen the subject. Not with his children grown, not with his own retirement pension finally secured, not with the guilt somehow easier to carry privately than to detonate publicly. The tape's final section provided specific instructions: a safety deposit box at First Meridian Bank, box number 114, containing what Walter estimated as enough to finally make someone listen, if you're both willing to actually do something with it. The siblings retrieved the box 3 days later, finding 47 pages of maintenance logs, 11 water sample containers long since evaporated, but still labeled with dates and coordinates, and a stack of internal memos referencing the discharge violations in language that, even decades later, read as unmistakably deliberate. Karen, reviewing the documents with growing unease, realized the creek in question ran directly behind the elementary school she and David had attended as children, raising a question neither of them could avoid once it surfaced: whether their own childhood health had been affected by exposure their father had known about and never disclosed. David had been treated at 9 for an unexplained kidney function abnormality that resolved without a clear diagnosis, a medical mystery his pediatrician at the time attributed to an unidentified viral cause, an explanation that suddenly felt considerably less certain once placed beside his father's decades-old documentation, local health department records which Karen requested as part of the family's growing investigation, showed the surrounding neighborhood had reported a statistically elevated cluster of pediatric kidney and thyroid conditions across the 1985 to 1995 period, a pattern public health officials at the time attributed, without deeper investigation, to inconclusive and unrelated factors. David and Karen faced a genuinely difficult choice. Pursuing the documentation publicly risked their father's reputation, potentially complicated his pension's standing with any successor company, and offered no guarantee of accountability this many decades later, given applicable statutes of limitations on the original violations themselves. Attorney Priya Malhotra explained that while direct legal liability for the original 1980s discharge might be difficult to pursue, given elapsed statutes of limitations, ongoing groundwater contamination, if still detectable, could support a separate, currently actionable environmental claim, meaning the family's disclosure could still matter substantively, not merely symbolically. Independent environmental testing, commissioned by Priya's firm using Walter's original sample coordinates, found detectable contamination still present in groundwater near the original discharge site 35 years later, well above current safety thresholds. Proof the original violation had never been remediated, only buried. The facility, now operating under a different corporate parent following 2 ownership changes since Walter's era, initially denied any current contamination link until the state environmental agency's own follow-up testing, prompted by the family's formal complaint, corroborated the independent findings within 6 weeks. The company entered a consent agreement requiring a $4.2 million remediation project alongside a community health monitoring fund, an outcome David described not as vindication for his father exactly, but as the thing he should have gotten to see happen himself 35 years late. Rather than treating the revelation as a scandal to manage quietly, David and Karen chose to speak publicly about their father's tape, framing his decades-long silence honestly, not as heroism, but as an understandable, deeply human failure that he'd ultimately, if belatedly, tried to correct from beyond the point where it could cost him anything further. The family established the Walter Meyer Environmental Accountability Fund, supporting whistleblower legal defense costs for employees facing retaliation for reporting environmental violations. A cause chosen specifically because, as Karen put it, the thing that actually would have helped my dad wasn't more guilt. It was somewhere safe to go with what he knew, 35 years ago, before it became a secret he had to carry alone. Walter didn't wait until death to try to make things right. He tried, imperfectly, 22 years before his actual death, and then found himself unable to finish what he'd started once the immediate fear of dying passed. The lesson isn't that courage delayed is the same as courage exercised, or that a tape found after death fully absolves the years of silence that preceded it. It's that doing the right thing late is still meaningfully different from never doing it at all. And that the families left holding a parent's unfinished reckoning get to decide for themselves whether to let that unfinished business stay buried or to finally carry it the rest of the way home.